You indicated that the majority of the land possessed by American Indians was stolen by the U.S. government and settlers. That being the case, do you believe the United States government should intervene and declare the Lakota people as the rightful owners of Wounded Knee?
Absolutely. I truly believe that. You know, the man should get the $14,000 that it's actually worth, and maybe a little bit more, but he shouldn't be seeking to get millions of dollars. I mean, I think the United States government owes the Great Sioux Nation, the Lakota people, they owe the land that was illegally taken and stolen in unfair trade practices.
Broadcasting from New York City to the world, it's the G-Man Interviews.
Welcome. On August 1st of this year, Radley Balko, an investigative reporter for the Huffington Post, wrote an article that revealed how prosecutors withheld crucial evidence that would have exonerated a man accused of carjacking and murder. The prosecutors were also complicit in having the innocent man, John Thompson, placed on death row. Balko noted the following. He was wrongly convicted not once, but twice, separately, for a carjacking and a murder. He spent 18 years at the Louisiana State Penitentiary, 14 of them on death row. His death warrant was signed 8 times. When his attorneys finally found the evidence that cleared him, evidence his prosecutors had known about for years, he was weeks away from execution. But what most enrages Thompson, and what drives his activism today, is that in the end, there was no accountability. His case produced a surfeit of prosecutorial malfeasance, from incompetence to poor training to a culture of conviction that included willfully ignoring evidence that could have led to his exoneration to blatantly withholding it. Yet, the only attorney ever disciplined in the case was a former prosecutor who eventually aided in Thompson's defense. This isn't about bad men, though they were most assuredly bad men, Thompson says. It's about a system that's void of integrity. Mistakes can happen, but if you don't do anything to stop them from happening again, you can't keep calling them mistakes. A link to the full article has been posted below. Joining us to discuss the Thompson case and her experiences with similar cases is Tristan Bonn. Ms. Bonn has taught both civil and criminal law classes for over 20 years at various institutions and served as a senior prosecuting attorney in the Colorado Springs City Attorney's Office for nearly 8 years. She was also the first police auditor for the City of Omaha for almost 6 years and appeared in a previous episode to discuss systemic brutality and misconduct within the Omaha Police Department. Shortly after her appearance, and in an investigation by the department, 2 officers were fired for allegedly tampering with evidence in a brutality case. In addition, the U.S. Justice Department launched an investigation into possible civil rights violations by the 2 officers and the OPD. It's a pleasure to have you on the show once again, Ms. Bonn.
Thank you.
I guess the best place to start is by asking the most obvious question. The Thompson case. How does something like this happen?
Well, as you probably know, the numbers of innocent people incarcerated and on death row has increased dramatically over the past 20 years, or at least our awareness of them have through this Innocence Project. And we finally are getting more and more data and information where we can review what happens in these cases. And as you may be aware of from the Radley Balko article, there are a variety of reasons why this can happen. Unfortunately, the New Orleans District Attorney's Office, particularly under the Connick regime, was notoriously corrupt for exactly these reasons. And it's a brutal example of how an innocent person ends up on death row. But I think that the article does a great job of outlining how and why these things can happen. The upshot, I think, the most critical issue is what I would refer to as the culture of a district attorney's office, or the culture of the chief prosecutor, district attorney, city attorney, attorney general. And any office that is led by somebody who either encourages or turns a blind eye to prosecutorial ethics is going to end up with exactly these kinds of wrongful convictions.
Given the fact that prosecutors knew Thompson was innocent and still placed him on death row, would it be fair or unfair for someone to say corruption has firmly rooted itself within the criminal justice system?
Well, I've been of the opinion that corruption has firmly rooted itself in the criminal justice system since I began as auditor 12 years ago. At least that's when it came fully to my attention. Now, I have been aware of prosecutorial misconduct as you know, I was a former prosecutor, and not so much in the office I worked in. Number one, it was a misdemeanor office. Number two, we had a city attorney who would not tolerate in any way, shape, or form prosecutorial misconduct. But there were other offices on the Front Range of Colorado where I practiced where this mentality would seep in, and the mentality was very overly aggressive. A lot of importance placed on win-loss records as though it were a sport, not justice. And when you have that kind of sensibility that seeps into your office, it's very easy for a prosecution office to start to become corrupted. And it can be by small steps to begin with. For instance, the article in the Huffington Post cites the Brady Rule, which requires a prosecutor to turn over all exculpatory evidence to the other side. In other words, any evidence that could benefit the defendant needs to be turned over. And this is the easiest way for prosecutors to start to go down the path of what I consider unethical or corrupt. And that is, you can conceal evidence that will help the other side. And that's probably fundamentally the biggest temptation for corruption.
Every year, we seem to hear more and more news reports about convicted criminals having their convictions overturned after DNA evidence exonerated them. However, others were executed after repeated efforts to prove their innocence. There are hundreds of thousands of examples of injustice in the courtroom on record. But do you believe the Thompson case has an opportunity to set a precedent in terms of making sure prosecutors are held accountable?
You know, I would certainly hope so. I do think that there are some major reportings that are starting to kind of come to a confluence. For instance, in New York City, just a day or two ago, the judge released her order on the stop and frisk case. That, by the way, the expert in that case is Sam Walker, the professor here from Omaha, a friend and colleague of mine, and he's cited throughout her remedy opinion, because the overly aggressive policing has a parallel in this overly aggressive prosecution. And many people are watching that case because she's issued all kinds of remedies and reforms that need to take place. And that is reaching, you know, a wider and wider audience a week after we see this article in the Huffington Post about prosecutorial misconduct. But the judge in that case coins what I think is exactly the issue, and she calls it unconstitutionally aggressive policing, and I would include prosecution. Unconstitutionally aggressive policing and prosecution. And that's where both police and prosecutors really kind of throw the law book out the window and will go after people, like in the stop and frisks, where they do not have any reasonable articulable suspicion to stop and frisk someone, or in the case of prosecutors, they will go after people for a conviction regardless of the evidence. And that, to me, absent the immunities that are provided under the law, that borders on criminal behavior.
What would you say to those who vehemently argue that the reason more blacks are stopped and frisked, arrested, and placed in jail is because they commit the highest percentage of crime?
That's one of the misconceptions that really offends me the most. First of all, it's not accurate. I think that Sam Walker, in fact, has a book on crime statistics, number one. But number two, the thing that really outrages me the most is In a stop and frisk case, a stop and frisk is not based on any kind of statistic or percentage. It has to be based on each and every case, an individual case, and it has to be based on actual facts, the observation of the police officer, for instance. So to say, gosh, I'm in a predominantly black or brown neighborhood and I see someone who's in a high crime area, based on percentages as a basis to contact that person is really outrageous. That's what is unconstitutional. And it's very self-replicating in a very dangerous way, because then you increase those same crime statistics that people rely on to make these statements about stopping black or brown people with greater frequency. And that's the exact type of enculturation about black and brown people committing crimes that leads to the type of incident that we had in the Trayvon Martin case, where the defendant in the lawsuit or in the prosecution is claiming that he had reason to believe or reasonable suspicion based primarily on someone's color. And that's exactly what we have to stop. It's outrageous and it's unconstitutional.
Who or what is responsible for the mandate which protects prosecutors from criminal charges or lawsuits?
Well, since I was in law school, it's been, many, many moons ago, you have shifted away from that Warren court that was much more protective of civil liberties to a much, much more conservative court. And they've really kind of hollowed out the Fourth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment, of course, the citizens' protection from, again, aggressive policing or unreasonable policing. And over the years, you've seen that reinforced by a more conservative court. I think Justice Scalia and Justice Thomas are the two probably most pro-prosecution, and in many ways, I think, mistakenly. I don't think they have a very clear awareness of what actually happens in the criminal justice system, quite frankly. And so I think that currently they're probably the two biggest proponents of hollowing out the Fourth Amendment, which used to give citizens more protection from the police.
Activists across the country have repeatedly called for an overhaul of the criminal justice system, and they've cited cases like Thompson's as justification for the measures. If this were to happen, should the federal government, the states, or another entity be entrusted with the task?
Unfortunately, I think with the federal government, it's just in many ways too far removed from the actual problem, although some of the best oversight comes at that level. You probably know Michelle Alexander in her book, The New Jim Crow, is actually calling for like a whole social movement, which I think would be more powerful if it comes from the ground up, from the people up. Justice Holder's Justice Department, at least in their special litigation unit, which does oversight of policing, they've been more active, but it hasn't been, widespread enough. There's a lot of shortages. And so I think in many ways, again, it can come from a more local level. People at local and state levels can insist that their prosecutors are more, and judges and police are more ethical and are more mindful of what those rules are. And we all share some complicity in this by not demanding that innocent people be released, that there's accountability for police, prosecutors, and judges. And I think that, again, that culture needs to be highlighted. Too many times I think on these cable, crime shows, and it's very sensational, and people have sort of a bloodlust for some of these crime cases as though, like I said, they were some kind of sport, and they're not. Right across the river from us in Omaha was the Potawatomi case on Mr. Harrington, who was ridiculously incarcerated unlawfully for years. And so we've had some exposure to that, and people have to become more outspoken about demanding this kind of accountability.
What major change would you implement to transform the system?
So many of the remedies are already in the system. They're just not being activated. They are not being used. And let me explain. Judges are supposed to report prosecutors to the Bar Association for the kind of behavior that led to Mr. Thompson's incarceration convictions, false convictions. They need to be reported. The same thing is true for prosecutors. Prosecutors need to report other prosecutors. Prosecutors need to also give feedback to their police department. Police officers need to report one another. For a self-reporting system to work, the people in the system have to report. And what I think, again, the Huffington Post article describes is, number one, this sort of socializing, they call it sort of the Christmas party rule, where because lawyers all go out together, they're not going to report each other. Well, that's simply unacceptable. You have an ethical obligation to report so that proper action can take place. But another factor, and quite frankly it's more sinister, and it has to do with a lot of the union corruption that's also involved. For instance, in Omaha, the police union has organized and gone after judges and prosecutors in their elections. Gone after, I don't mean that in a criminal way. I mean it in a political way, and have gone after judges and prosecutors who were not favorable to them, even though they were lawful decisions, and have unseated them. They've unseated judges, and they've likewise made, political threats to prosecutors who go against them. So I think that also terribly infects the system, and it's this overall politicization of the criminal justice system that I think has really corrupted it so much in the years past. And I wish I knew what the secret was to deflate the politics in criminal justice. But that has to happen in order for any hope of reform.
More and more prisons are being built in this country. As a result, the number of arrests and convictions isn't likely to decrease. This being the case, is prosecutorial misconduct likely to get much worse before it gets better?
You've hit on exactly what the issue is. And for those of us who've been in the field for quite a while, this is kind of, the backstop is that the housing of more and more either nonviolent or innocent inmates in prisons is the end result of this pipeline, as it's been described by many. And if you start at the stop and frisk portal, or racial profiling portal, which is what I call it, you can just see in so many instances, how people end up in this pipeline. And the federal or state penitentiaries are the end result. Now, for instance, again, in Nebraska, we're already over the 144% federal mandate of, prison population. It's too overcrowded. And we just built a prison here, a few years ago, and it's already full. So this is on the front page of our paper locally, too. Are we seriously going to spend another millions and millions of dollars to construct another prison when there's no end in sight, when you have exactly this kind of policing and prosecutorial misconduct that goes on? Now, a lot of times the reform is aimed at trying to get offenders out that are nonviolent, like drug cases or nonviolent offenses, or minimum mandatory sentences that are often, really skewed, that you have somebody in prison for fairly minor charges. So some of the reform is at the end of not getting people involved in the system in the first place. I think probably the most significant thing that has happened in just the past few recent years has been the emphasis on how this whole cycle, whole pipeline works. We've actually had some headway in seeing both conservatives and liberals joining together to try to dismantle this machinery, because it's incredibly expensive. It's totally unjust in so many cases, and it just plain doesn't work. It doesn't solve any of the problems that it's designed to. So in some ways, I actually think there's more opportunity now than there has been in quite a while to try to reform that. But I think it's probably got to come from a more local level because the federal government is just so broken.
Are people of color more likely to be victimized by corrupt prosecutors than whites, even if they commit the same crime?
In my experience, the answer is yes. Again, so much of this depends on I think the culture. Where I prosecuted in Colorado, as I say, I was fortunate, and I look back and see how lucky I was to be under a visionary city attorney whose one of the main principles in his office was similarly situated people must be treated the same. It's simple. I mean, that's simple. Unfortunately, when I moved to Omaha, that was far from the case, and the picture in Omaha mirrors the picture across the country. And recently a colleague reported to me that there had been somebody at their university who had toured the local jail here, and there were just a handful of whites. Everybody else was black or brown, predominantly black. And I've reported myself on what I think the reasons for that in Omaha are. You see this high concentration of, again, this unconstitutional, overly aggressive policing, primarily in communities of color. And I think the stop and frisk cases in New York replicate the same pattern we see across the United States. And what you do is you have these basically dragnets where you scoop up a whole bunch of people in a high crime area, which may or may not be, for instance, an African American community. But what happens is the practice becomes, self-replicating. The more people you scoop up and arrest on bogus or unconstitutional charges, the higher number of spikes you get in your crime data. So it just keeps repeating itself. And then you can see this same treatment throughout the system. More blacks get arrested as opposed to just cited. More blacks then will be incarcerated. Bail is set higher. Plea agreements are less favorable. They can't afford an attorney. They may enter into a plea agreement that jeopardizes their future. For instance, they may get a conviction for resisting arrest. That makes it difficult to find a job. It's also the type of charge a prosecutor looks at and says, I'm not going to give you a break in plea agreement. So you see how it's compounding through the system. Then, for instance, a young African-American man in that case may have the resisting conviction young in his life. He may get a few other minor charges. It's hard for him to get a job, and the next thing you know, he's in a 3 strikes, you're out. That conviction may put him in a higher incarceration, and that's how you see it go. Now, of course, that's not the case in every case, but it is very frequent in communities of color.
If people of color are more likely to be victimized by unscrupulous prosecutors, and evidence could be produced to support this, wouldn't that be incentive enough to have the Justice Department launch an investigation into possible civil rights violations on a state-by-state basis and hold prosecutors accountable?
The Special Litigation Unit in the Justice Department has actually been undertaking those types of investigations of police departments. And I think there have been 13 to 15 consent decrees issued during the Obama administration. The real sort of activity of the Special Litigation Unit probably started with Ashcroft, kind of fell off with Gonzalez, has picked back up. So there is activity there. And quite frankly, there has been some real progress in describing what a constitutional police department should look like. Steps that need to be taken for training, in-house accountability, all of those things. So the standards are out there. It's just been a matter of getting those standards to enough police departments. It's my understanding that the investigations are just stacked deep There are more investigations of police departments than there are prosecutors to investigate out of the Justice Department. But yes, I would recommend that same practice and those exact same approaches also extend to prosecution offices. Part of the problem, and the article again from the Huffington Post describes this, is getting your hands on enough of the evidence, because so much of the information is secreted. But if you have a bad police department, you can almost be assured you also have corruption in your prosecution office, because police departments, generally speaking, cannot behave in that fashion without some complicity from prosecution offices.
As a former prosecutor, what would you say to family members whose loved ones are facing a similar situation as John Thompson, but they don't have the benefit of an education or the financial means to challenge the criminal justice system?
You know, I've actually dealt with many people who are facing this heavy-handed policing, and it is very frustrating because it's difficult. It's expensive to fight, and the people that I have seen who've had the most success have basically been the loudest. They've questioned the most, they've demanded information, they have gotten the community early on in their cases to rally behind them. And so often, I think, once you are indicted or you're charged with any kind of crime, people, naturally they have embarrassment and humiliation, and they really shut down. That is actually when I think the most questioning needs to happen. Unfortunately, there are not a lot of lawyers who will take some of these cases against the police departments, especially in Omaha. You have to go to Iowa to find lawyers who will go against the police department here. And so that makes it difficult. But you have to increase that awareness, and in your own individual case, one of the ways you can do that is to rally the community. We're trying to actually organize here in Omaha in a way that anytime these cases start to happen or somebody's charged, we've got a group of people who can start to support the person or family going through this kind of ordeal.
If people would like to contact you or find out more information about you, how can they go about doing that?
I just recently opened my blog, for instance, for comment, and I will put my email and phone number on there, but I have no problem saying my phone number right now where I can take calls is 402-403-0601. Direct line there with an answering, and if you call for questions, I will be happy to get back to you with whatever information I can help you with.
And what's the address for your blog?
www.omahapoliceauditor.com. And I might add, on my blog, I also try to supply best practices, other cases, recommendations I've made in the past. So I'm trying to put out as much information as I can for people who may be, number one, interested, or number two, living through this. If you contact me, the other thing I would be happy to do is put you in touch with people that I know who've been through this, and or lawyers that I know who have represented people in these situations.
Once again, it's been a pleasure having you on the show, Ms. Bonn.
Yes, and thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to get the message out.
And that's going to do it for this edition of the G-Man Interviews. As usual, if you'd like to contact me or send me a comment regarding this episode, you can send me an email at fromthegman@gmail.com. I also invite you to visit my profile page. There's a donation button where you can click there to support this channel and the work that's showcased. Until next time, stay cool, stay safe, and stay informed.